Hello humans, it's just Martine, and today we're going to be rereading and ranking all of John Green's books. I've been a John Green stan for a really long time. I was first introduced to his books back when they were really gaining some commercial success, so around the time that The Fault in Our Stars was really gaining traction, I would say. And it's been interesting to watch his career evolve over the years since then, as I started following him on like Vlogbrothers and such, and to see as he has now entered his like nonfiction era with The Anthropocene Reviewed a couple of years ago and his new book, Everything is Tuberculosis, coming out I think in 2025. So I thought now would be a perfect time to do a recap, read all the John Green books, and rank them to see which is my favorite. I do have one caveat to this. I'm not going to read Let It Snow, and that's because it doesn't feel like it's really a John Green book, because he only wrote a third of it. To me, a John Green book is a book that John Green wrote at least half of. And yes, he is an author on Let It Snow, but I don't know. It just felt like I had enough books for this video already. And I knew that the majority of my rating for Let It Snow would probably come from the influence of the other two authors, and I wanted the rating to be more attributed to John Green's writing itself. That being said, I am reading Will Grayson because that's half authored by John Green. And I just wanted to. And I make the rules. So for this video, I'll be going in reverse publication order from his newest book to his oldest book. And then at the end of this, we'll see which is my favorite John Green book. So the most recent book was The Anthropocene Reviewed, which I think first came out in 2021. And I read it when it first came out. The first time I read it, I listened to the audiobook because John Green narrates it. And if you don't know, the idea behind this book originally started as a podcast. And that podcast is called The Anthropocene Reviewed. And John Green goes and he reviews various things. For example, Diet Dr. Pepper, air conditioning, humanity's temporal range, etc. So this book is like basically as close to a memoir as he'll ever get, because he's largely talking about his experiences with all these things that he's writing essays about. I really enjoyed it when I first read it. I gave it 5 stars. And then I think it was last year I went to an event when the paperback edition came out because he came and spoke. So I went to that event. I'm pretty sure I vlogged it. That was a really special event because he wrote this during the height of the pandemic. It was published still during the height of the pandemic, and so even though it was a couple years later and for the paperback release, it was the first time he had sat with other people and talked about this book and read from it out loud to people. So that was really special to be there for that. And so as part of my ticket for that event, I got a signed paperback copy of the book, which I then read for this. And I have to say, this book still gets 5 stars. In fact, I might have liked it even better this time. I do love when John Green narrates his own stuff, and I listen to John Green talk a lot because I watch all of his videos, but I do have to say, I'm just not a big audiobook person, and so I think part of the reason I enjoyed this even better the second time was because I read it with my eyeballs. That being said, I just think it was more special now for 2 main reasons. The first is that I've heard him read some of these essays out loud in front of me. And so I have memories of that, and reading those essays were very special. But I think the second big reason this was even more special this time is that even though COVID continues to run rampant and we're seeing a surge right now, we are not in the height of the pandemic like we were when this was first published. And he talks a lot about that experience, and it made me think a lot about my experiences in the pandemic, which were very emotional to think back on. I even like teared up a bit at the introduction and just thinking about how time has changed since the first time that I read this book and this second time. And also, interestingly enough, I first read this book at home. I remember pacing around this very room listening to the audiobook, so getting to be home while reading this again was also very special. He even talks at one point about like, I don't know if you're reading this while this is still happening or if we've moved past this. And it's so surreal because the first time I was reading this, we were very much still in the height of things. And now, even though COVID is around, we're in that new normal that he kind of talks about and wonders what it will be like. So that was pretty incredible to read and then think about. That being said, it's not all nostalgia that makes this a 5-star read. It's just genuinely so good. John Green's brain is an incredible place. I know it can be terrifying for him to live in his brain with his OCD, but a ton of his brain is just awesome, pure awesome, and this book comes out of that awesome. He's so philosophical, deep thinking. He's got so many quotations from other people floating around in his brain and so many interesting stories and takes, and I just loved reading them. Like, some of these things you go, yeah, I could see why you'd review that, but then some you go, how are you going to review this? And it turns out to be incredible. For example, the QWERTY keyboard, it's like, how are you going to make that interesting for me? But he did. The Hall of Presidents in Magic Kingdom, how are you going to make that interesting? But he did. I loved so many of these essays, and I always learn so much from them every time I read them, because they're just chock full of genuinely interesting information about the history of things and human interaction with those things and all of that. So very interesting. I will say this book is going to make it immediately hard to make this video because the rest of his books are fiction. And so how am I going to compare his fiction to his nonfiction? Especially when his nonfiction reminds me of his videos. And that feels like a very specific voice. And even though it all feels like John Green, this just feels a lot more personal, which I enjoy because watching his videos is a lot more personal, right? Usually we have so much distance from the authors who write the stories that we read. But because of his online presence since like the inception of YouTube, basically, he feels a lot closer than other storytellers, which maybe he'd hate, you know? I'm sure that's something that causes him great distress because in actuality, I don't know that man, but there's something honest about his nonfiction work that I just really love. We're going to have to see how it measures up to this one because I give the Anthropocene Reviewed 5 stars. Okay, next in reverse publication order is Turtles All the Way Down. And so I read this again and I'm giving it 4 stars. I think it was so interesting reading this in the order that I did, so the Anthropocene Reviewed and then this, because so many things, at least a handful, a solid handful of things that are mentioned in the Anthropocene Reviewed are mentioned in this book. For example, wintry mix. And I know that's because a lot of things in the Anthropocene Reviewed are talking about Indianapolis, where John lives, and this is set in Indianapolis. John even mentions one scene in this book in the Anthropocene Reviewed, but it was still weird to read them like back to back, basically. Things that I enjoyed about this one. The Own Voices OCD representation is incredible. It is painful to be in this character's mind all the time, as it should be. That is a good representation of mental health. I remember reading this one book by Alexis Hall where the main character had anxiety and a lot of people were talking about how they hated that in the book, like they hated being in his brain and so they lowered the rating. In my opinion, that's a reason to bring the rating up because that's a good representation of anxiety. It is not pleasant to be in an anxious brain. And people were like, but they went too far. Well, that's what anxiety does. Anxiety goes way too far. So anyway, that part of this was good. In this one, we're following Aza. She's a teenager and she has OCD, but more than that, she finds herself at the center of this case where this like billionaire goes missing and she knows the billionaire's son. And so her best friend kind of gets her involved in the case because there's reward money for finding information that leads to the billionaire. So they get involved in the case and things kind of go from there. I think my main complaint about this book was the connection between Aza and this boy whose father had disappeared, Davis, because I didn't really understand their connection. Like I felt like there wasn't really a pull between them in the way that I wanted there to be. I understand that at the end of the day, one thing that stood between them as people was Aza's OCD and her thoughts. And since we were in her brain, it's fair that I felt some distance. But at the moments when she felt closer to him, I didn't. And so I feel like that's a balancing act that didn't quite work out exactly how I wanted it to. That said, there are so many good quotes in this book, and I just realized that I put the cover on upside down because I read it without the dust jacket on. Oops. I liked this a little bit less than the Anthropocene Reviewed, but it's still a really good book. I doubt I'm going to read any of these books and feel like they're not good. This one came out, oh my goodness. This book is older than I thought. It came out in 2017. So I was 17 when I first read this book. I was still in high school. Wow. So far the tier ranking is the Anthropocene Reviewed and then Turtles All the Way Down. We'll see what happens from here. Okay, this one's a pretty exciting one to talk about because I would argue this is John Green's most famous book, The Fault in Our Stars, which I did read back in the day, around the time when the movie was made, like when it was really popular. And interestingly enough, when I read this book, I had no idea who John Green was. I had actually read one of his books before without realizing it, I guess. I had read An Abundance of Catherines before this, but I didn't know that he made YouTube videos with his brother, which is hilarious because now I am a very avid Vlogbrothers fan. I watch almost all of their videos. I love what they do. And I remember distinctly the feeling that I had the day that I discovered that he made YouTube videos. It was such a weird feeling because I was Googling him about like his books and the videos are what came up too. And I was like, what? Anyway, the point is, The Fault in Our Stars. I saw the movie when it first came out. I had read the book already. It was very big that year. I think the year it came out as a movie was like my freshman year of high school. Regardless, it was very, very popular. On Reread, I'm giving it 4.5 stars. I still think it's very good. If you happen not to know, The Fault in Our Stars is this book about this girl, Hazel. She's got cancer, real bad. She goes to this cancer support group, and through this support group, she meets this dude. His name is Augustus Waters, and he's incredibly pretentious and loves a metaphor. This story is about their bond and their friendship and relationship and all of those things. It is, I think, the quintessential sick kid book. Through the Vlogbrothers community, John met this young woman named Esther who died of cancer. Although this book is not about Esther, it was written after that all happened. So, you know, there was some inspiration there somewhere. Also, as a young man, John Green worked as a chaplain in a hospital, so I'm sure he saw many a sick child. He wrote this book, and listen, like the characters in it are pretentious, and some people make the argument with John Green that he writes teenagers that don't talk like teenagers. They're like teenagers don't actually think or talk like that, but I think they're underestimating teenagers. I think a lot of teenagers have deeply existential and pretentious thoughts about everything. It's weird reading it this time around because now I know what John Green's voice is like. And when I read it the first time, I didn't know. And so it felt like this wild thing to read. Like the voice in it just felt crazy and new. It didn't like oversimplify adolescence in the way that some other authors do. Reading it now, I'm like, yeah, no, it's just John Green's writing. And so in some ways, the magic was taken away a little. But in some ways, a different magic was added. I remember the feeling of watching the movie for the first time, too, very strongly. I remember which movie theater I was in. I remember that the only time I even sort of cried was at the Ed Sheeran song at the end. Which that song is still beautiful, by the way. There were some things that were very random in this, but I think life can be really random. So that's that. And it was a really fast read. I mean, I read it in one day, straight up, just one day, read the book. So 4.5 stars it is. It's time to talk about Will Grayson, Will Grayson. I'm giving it 5 stars, which is the first fiction book in this video that I'm giving 5 stars. I can't decide if it really deserves the 5 stars or what. It's like partially nostalgia that bumped it up. But I'm nostalgic about all of these books, and I liked this one better than, say, Turtles All the Way Down or The Fault in Our Stars. So, yeah, 5 stars. I'm sorry it's so shiny. I'll put this down. I'll start by telling you what it's about, and then we'll talk about like my history with the book, how I felt reading it this time, etc. Hopefully I won't ramble on for too long. This book is about 2 boys, both of whom are named Will Grayson. One is written by John Green, and one is written by David Levithan. They're both going through very different things in their lives. One, I can't even call like one Will Grayson and the other something else. John Green's Will Grayson is kind of dealing with the fact that he feels like the only way to survive in life is to like shut up and not have opinions and just move through life. But he's got this very, very loud best friend, Tiny Cooper. Tiny is writing a musical about his life, and Tiny is very, very gay. So that's one Will Grayson. The other Will Grayson, David Levithan's Will Grayson, writes in all lowercase. And as David Levithan says in the interview at the end of the book, it's because he views himself as a lowercase person. He has got major depression, and it is well written. Dude is majorly depressed. And he's got this secret instant messaging relationship online with this guy, Isaac. And that's like the only thing that he likes about his life. And through a series of chances, these 2 Will Graysons meet. Tiny Cooper ends up being the bridge between their 2 stories. So it's like, it's a book about 2 guys named Will Grayson, but Tiny Cooper is a main character in this book. He's technically a secondary character in both of their lives, but to me, he is a main character. The voices of the 2 different Will Graysons sound different enough, and yet it all feels so cohesive that it is actually miraculous that two people wrote this book, in my opinion. And reading it was just so fun. I cannot remember when I last read this book, and I read it before I had Goodreads, so I have no way of knowing. I know that this is my original copy. I know that it got caught in a bit of a flood in my room, so it's got some water damage, but she survived. And I know I've been wanting to reread it for a very long time, because this was one of the first queer books I read. Definitely one of the first queer young adult books that I read. And that mattered a lot. I was still finding myself at the time when I read this book. I still didn't, even when I was done with this, know who I was, you know? Although finding yourself is a whole lifelong process. But the point is, this book was a rare type of book at its time. One of these reviews said it. They talk about how there has really not been a book like this for a young adult audience before, and they're definitely not numerous at this time. Nowadays, there's so many queer YA books, and that's incredible. But I remember how different it was to read about those characters when I read this book in the first place. So if I had never read this before, and I read it now, without that history, I would still enjoy it, but I would partially be like, what is the big deal? But it was a huge deal, not only for like the whole world, but for me specifically. Also, when I read this book, I think I'd only read one John Green book before, An Abundance of Catherines, although I can't be for sure about that. Point is, I had not read much John Green, and I don't think I had ever read a David Levithan book. I've read a lot more books by David Levithan in the past 2 years than any other time in my life. I've read backlist David Levithan, I've read new release David Levithan, I've read it all, you know? Not all. I still have a couple to read. When I read this, I hadn't read any of his work. The way that this feels, though, I know that both of these authors contributed to it, because it gives me the feel both of a John Green book, but also of a David Levithan book, which is just incredible to have both of them together and have both of those things come across. And if you haven't read a ton of work by either one of them, then you wouldn't know the feeling that I'm talking about, and it is impossible for me to describe, so I might as well not try. It was surreal to read this book, though, because I felt like I remembered very little from it, or at least that's what I thought going in. I even forgot Tiny Cooper's name, but I remembered him being the bridge between the two Will Graysons, and I knew that there were two Will Graysons. That was pretty much all I remembered, but as soon as I started rereading this book, so much came back to me. Not even in distinct memories or certainties, but into like, wait a second, is this going to happen? And then it did, to the point where like there's one big plot twist in this book, not even that far in. It's when the two Will Graysons meet, basically. There's a plot twist surrounding that incident that when I started reading this book, I was like, wait, does this happen or am I going crazy? And so I like wrote it down in a note in my phone to be like, this is the case, right? Because I didn't want it to just seem like confirmation bias later if it happened, but it did happen. I was correct. So that came back to me very suddenly, just from reading like a couple of lines. I was like, wait a second, I remember this plot twist. I'd also very much blocked out all the information about Tiny's musical in this, which is hilarious because Harris has been writing a musical for a while now, and reading this reminded me a lot of our conversations about it. Basically, it was surreal to reread this. I'm so glad I did, though. I love the characters in this book. Some of them are very stereotypical, and some are very not stereotypical. I love the representation of the Major Depression in here. I love how both Wills are going through such different things, and yet at the same time, they're going through some very similar things thematically. I think that's a great lesson for how two very different people can still understand each other in some very big ways. So far, yeah, out of the fictions, I can't say compared to the Anthropocene reviewed, but out of the fictions, this is my favorite reread so far. And now, where are we going next? I think we're going to Paper Towns? Yeah, next up is Paper Towns. So I'm interested for that one. I think my experience with this next one is pretty interesting because it's Paper Towns. I think I read this first in like 9th, maybe 10th grade. Reading it now was interesting. I had low expectations because I think in this past year it was, my friend Bailey from Is Bailey Reading reread this book and felt like it didn't hit. And I think she gave it like a 3.5 stars. So I went in kind of nervous. And I have to say, I can totally see why that was her rating. At the end of the day, this is a book about a boy who's chasing a girl. The different sections are a little weirdly disconnected, and yet I had a really, really good time reading this, and I'm giving it 4 stars. I think what really saved this book for me was the setting. This book is largely set I would say, in Orlando, Florida, which is where John Green grew up and which is a place that I'm very familiar with. But I think what's interesting is that growing up, when I first read this book, I had been to Orlando several times, like Florida kid, I'd been to Disney, but being in the parks part of Orlando is not the same thing as experiencing Orlando. And it is definitely not the same as experiencing downtown Orlando. And downtown Orlando plays a prominent role in a couple scenes of this book, particularly in the first third. In the first third of this book, we're following this character, and he has lived next door to this girl his whole life, been obsessed with her, but she's popular at school, and he's not. And one night, she knocks on his window, and she's like, we're going to go on an adventure, and they go around town playing all of these pranks. And at one point, they go to downtown Orlando, and they go to the top of this really tall building, and they look out over all of Orlando. And growing up, I didn't have any experience with downtown Orlando, and now I do. I have quite a bit of experience with downtown Orlando. And the thing about Orlando in this book is that the primary female character, Margot Roth Spiegelman, has a lot of commentary about Orlando as a city and the people in it. And so to have a better understanding of Orlando and the people in it, and to read this book, was way more fascinating than it would have been if I didn't have that information. I think growing up, this book was still fun. It was definitely never my favorite John Green, but I had a good time. The part I really appreciated was the part about Orlando. It almost felt to me like Orlando was another character in this book. And it was a character that I knew and had commentary that I understood. I think it was so fascinating reading this book from the perspective of knowing Orlando, and I think that's what really made this experience a 4-star experience for me instead of something lower. I just remembered that another Orlando fun fact that made me really, really giddy while I was rereading this book is the name of the high school that the main characters in this book go to. They go to Winter Park High School, and the reason that I was geeking out about that is that my favorite book series of all time is Kingdom Keepers by Ridley Pearson. And in Kingdom Keepers, the characters start in middle school, but they become high schoolers throughout the series. And when they become high schoolers, we learn the names of their high schools. And Finn Whitman, the main character of the series, and then Amanda, one of the secondary characters, both of them go to Winter Park High School. So in my mind, while I was reading this, I was like, Finn Whitman is somewhere in these halls at the same time that this main character is in these halls. And that is hilarious to me. Because Paper Towns was published in 2008, and the Kingdom Keepers books were very much still being published in 2008. That just made me giggle the whole time. I also will say, this book is a very clear example of like the John Green formula, where we take a character who's obsessed with something, we send them after a little bit of a mystery, nothing insane, just a little bit of a mystery, and they learn about themselves in the process. That's like what John Green does. And spoiler alert, I'm late to filming reviews, and so I've finished the first 2 John Green books that were published. And you will also notice when I talk about those that they follow the John Green formula. An Abundance of Catherines. Now, I don't fully trust my memory on this, but I do believe this was the first John Green book I ever read. At the very least, when I read it, I did not know who John Green was. I actually picked up this book because it was in my 8th grade language arts teacher's class library. It looked interesting to me, so I read it. I flew through it. I absolutely loved it, and I haven't read it since. So when was I in 8th grade? It's been over a decade since I read this book, and reading it now was a very interesting experience. I'm giving it 4 stars, but I will say that the 4 stars is heavily influenced by nostalgia. I still think it was like pretty good and did some interesting things, but I was mainly like, oh yeah, I remember this. And even though I read it over a decade ago, and I don't even remember what I read last week, there are some things about this book that I did remember, namely the secret cave. That's it. That's pretty much all I remembered. I remembered the concept, like he's dated 19 Catherines. That's what I remembered, and I remembered the secret cave, which is such a random thing to remember over a decade later, but I do. In this one, we're following this guy, and he has exclusively dated girls named Catherine. He has dated 19 Catherines, technically 18 because 1 and 19 are the same. Anyway, so he's dated 19 girls named Catherine, they've all broken up with him, including this latest one, number 19. He's devastated. I forgot to mention he's also a child prodigy, which gives him a ton of angst in this book. And anyway, his best friend ends up taking him on a road trip to try and get over Catherine. I'm glad before I reread this that I did not know or look at what the internet thought of this book in general, and I got to enjoy it with my rose-colored glasses on. A lot of people hate this book. The representation in it is cringe at some points, rude at others. I saw one person in a review, though, that I looked up after say, like, you would have thought he had no sensitivity readers, but in fact he did, and they, like, okayed the best friend character, which was interesting. And so I think, like, a lot of people look at this at very face value, and that's okay. Like, I read books like that all the time, and I think it's because I've watched so many John Green videos and listened to him say so many things that when things were said on page, I kind of took a longer time to think about what he was trying to do with them, which I usually don't give authors that benefit of the doubt, I would say. At the end of the day, I think this main character is supposed to be so annoying, and his takes are not supposed to be the best. And although we're not reading directly from his perspective, it's the only John Green book written not in first-person perspective, which is very weird and disconcerting. It almost didn't feel like I was reading a John Green novel. We're still following this one dude and his world, and Colin as a main character is so self-centered and focused on what's happening with him that we do not get a clear view of the world around him because we are so consumed with the centrality of his issues. And I think that's very purposeful. Having somebody who's so self-centered that a third-person perspective only focuses on them. Like, I think that's how big his ego was at times and how much he was like, woe is me. I also loved the math bit in this. Basically, Colin decides his big thing is going to be that he makes an equation that can predict who's going to dump who and when in a relationship. Basically, he thinks he can chart a romantic relationship. And one of my favorite parts of the book was the afterword by the mathematician who's friends with John Green, who helped him write these equations. And obviously they don't actually predict romance, but they do make the graphs that we saw. And that was really fun for me because I'm a huge nerd. And I remember the math part of it was something that I found really cool when I first read it in 8th grade. It's partially very John Green formulaic. Sad white boy travels to try and figure out his life. On the other hand, it feels very different. Again, the writing almost didn't feel like John Green at all. Colin is annoying, but so many people are, and I think he's well-written and a well-written teenage prodigy, in spite of being a little bit terrible, also just a fascinating character. And I just had a fun time with this. And I think having fun is a good enough reason to like a book. So 4 stars, in spite of some people's controversy and opinions about this. They're welcome to have that. I had a good time, and it was very nostalgic for me, so it was fun rereading this. I don't think I'd reread it again after. There are other John Green books from this video I think I would reread again after in the future, but maybe not this one. We have finally made it to John Green's first published book, Looking for Alaska. I almost said Looking Through Alaska. It's Looking for Alaska. The first time I read this was not too long ago because I was using Goodreads by then. I first read it in September of 2018, which, yes, is like 6 years ago. But compared to the length of time it has been since I read some of these other John Green books, recent. I gave it the very same rating this time that I gave it the first time. I gave it 4.5 stars. This is in some ways so stereotypically John Green. We're following a guy. He has a very specific obsession. In this particular case, he's obsessed with people's last words, and he's also obsessed with a girl because he starts at a new boarding school, and at this boarding school he meets this girl named Alaska, and he very quickly falls head over heels for her. So many of the love interests in John Green books are like above it all, seem carefree, but also have a ton of problems. mysterious popular girls. So that's what Alaska is too. And they become friends at this boarding school. And this book is told in two parts. It is told in before and after. And I don't want to spoil what event marks the end of before and the start of after, but it is a pretty important event. And I had actually completely forgotten this event in the 6 years since I last read this book. This book was a lot more serious and dark than I remembered it being, which I think is what ended up giving it 4.5 stars then, because it would probably be a 4-star book, but the commentary on these big feelings, I don't even want to tell you what big feelings. The commentary on those big feelings is so good and so interesting, and it has themes that are explored in other John Green books that I liked better than some other John Green books, even in this video. I just thought this was a really solid one, which is crazy because I don't remember it being solid. I was like, I remember this one being okay, and then I read it and I was like, no, it's solid. And then when I was going on Goodreads to update, I noticed that I had given it the same exact rating the last time I read it. So apparently I just misremembered, because I do feel like if the thing that marks the difference between before and after in this book weren't what it is, this would be it would just be less good. That half star would be taken away. It would probably be more of a 4-star. It would be very much Paper Towns. Those two books have a lot of similarity, Looking for Alaska and Paper Towns. Lots of similarities. And yet the event in the middle of the book is so different, it feels like. So, not many other thoughts, and I know I probably talked for a really long time about some of these other books, and some of my TBRs are turning out way longer than I wanted, so I'll just stop talking here, and we'll see how I decide to rank all of these John Green books. Alright, those were the reviews. Let's do some ranking. I think my least favorite out of this whole video was An Abundance of Catherines, which is insane to say because it's definitely one of the books, if not the book, that got me into John Green books in the first place. And I think this fundamentally is because out of all of these books, it felt least like a John Green book. It's the only one written in third-person perspective. It's the only one where the voice doesn't sound so distinctly like John Green to me. Next up, I'm going to go with Paper Towns. None of these books were bad. I gave them all 4 stars or above, but I have to rank them anyway because that's the whole concept of this video. So Paper Towns was at risk of being the lowest one, but I really think what saved it was Orlando, and specifically Winter Park High School. I'm such a nerd for that, but it is what it is. And then my last 4-star read for this was Turtles All the Way Down, which was his most recent fiction book. So those are the 4 stars. And then we get into the 4.5 stars. I have 2 4.5 stars. I add The Fault in Our Stars, and I had Looking for Alaska. And out of the 2 of those, I'm going to say that I liked Looking Alaska less. There is something so iconic about The Fault in Our Stars that I had to give it some props. So that's going to rank above Looking for Alaska. And then we get into my 2 5 stars, Will Grayson, and The Anthropocene Reviewed. And I feel really weird making this decision because, as I've pointed out already, one of those is a fiction book and one is nonfiction. And furthermore, one of them is half-authored by a different person, which is my favorite of John Green's work. And for that reason, I think I'm going to say that my favorite book from this video was The Anthropocene Reviewed, for a couple of reasons. One, it was entirely John Green, and from start to finish, it felt so John Green. Because as a nonfiction and the closest to a memoir he'll ever write, it just was John Green. And I really enjoy John Green. I think he's fascinating and an excellent writer and a great critical thinker. So I loved hearing his real world perspectives. And also, The Anthropocene Reviewed means a lot to me, not only because I got to go to that author talk, but also just because it is so crazy to reread that now, see the ways that history repeats itself and the ways that history changes, see where we were, where we've come from, where we're going. I think it was such a hopeful book, and I distinctly remember one day during the height of the pandemic, walking across campus with Michaela. I was wearing a mask, obviously, and I looked up at the sky and I said, I don't think people understand quite how the world is never going to be the same after this. I think people really don't realize this is how life is now. It was just crazy reflecting back on that time and to look at the world around me and think it has changed in so many ways, for better and for worse. This book was very much a celebration of humanity and a realistic look at the ways that humanity can be terrible. I just loved it. So my favorite John Green book was The Anthropocene Reviewed. And with that, I'm going to end this video here. If you liked it, go ahead and give it a big thumbs up and comment down below what is your favorite John Green book, and subscribe for more bookish and college lifestyle content. And until next time, bye humans, bye!